in the life of the church. And so we asked for and expected a full accounting. And when the full accounting came about, it was obvious that the minister had made some very poor decisions, and we needed to resign, although he didn't want to. And so it became kind of a standoff between four of us. Thankfully, the other three individuals were much older than myself, more maturity, more wisdom, more stature in the life of the church. But one Sunday, we found ourselves invited to serve communion. And so the four of us sat on the front pew of the sanctuary. And during the sermon prior to communion, the minister preached about how he was kind of the Christ figure. And there were those in the congregation who were the Judas figures. And that we had betrayed him. And that Sunday, until the Sunday several months later when he left, when I or Bobby or Billy or James left the rear door of the sanctuary following the service, the minister turned his back to us. That was a very valuable lesson, a very painful but valuable lesson for a 23-year-old in the life of the church. About 8 years later, I was called to serve as youth minister of a church in Derby, Kansas. I had not yet been to seminary, but I thought that God was calling me through some experiences I had had in summer church camps, as counselor and other experiences, that was a ministry that I had some gifts in. And so Janine and I and our two young daughters, toddlers, we moved from Arkansas to Derby, Kansas. And almost immediately I met Bill and Barbara Carden. Barbara was one of the sweetest people I've ever known in my life. Bill was the opposite. Bill was a retired career sergeant, and from what I've told, sometimes sergeants in the life of the military are some of the gruff individuals that are there to make sure that the young soldiers learn their training well so that they will be protected if they're ever called upon to be in the field of battle. Bill continued that kind of gruff personality in his retirement in the life of the church, particularly towards this young youth minister. And I didn't really appreciate it. I was a little bit fearful of him, and I found myself beginning to avoid him at church meetings and around before and after church worship services. It was also a reality that Bill's daughter had been my predecessor. Her husband was in the military. They had been his daughter had been the part-time youth director of this church. Her husband was assigned duty in Germany, and so they moved to Germany, and so that's when I was brought in. So there was a little bit of friction there, it seemed, at least from my perspective as well. 2.5 years later, after enduring Bill for 2.5 years, avoiding Bill for about 2 of those 2.5 years, I decided if I was going to stay in ministry, I probably should go to seminary. And so Janine and I and our girls moved from Derby, Kansas to Austin, Texas, where I was enrolled at Austin Presbyterian Seminary. As typical, just before we were to move, there was a fellowship dinner to thank us for our ministry there. And as that dinner came to a close and people expressed, publicly their appreciation for the 2.5 years we had been there, then there was kind of an informal line that gathered to walk by and say goodbye to us. About halfway through the line of, 50 or 60 people, I looked out of the corner of my eye, and the very last person in the line was Bill Carden. I didn't know what to expect. But finally, Bill got to me. Most everyone else had left or was packing up to leave. And Bill took my hand, with his right hand, he took my right hand. He put his left hand on my shoulder and looked me directly in the eyes with tears in his eyes. And he said to me, "John, we have not always agreed, but your ministry here has been good for the young people, and I love you deeply." That was 34 years ago. It's still a very meaningful statement to me. Very meaningful. As far as I know, Bill is deceased. We lost touch with his family, but I have never forgotten Bill Carden. What he did for me on that last day of my ministry in Derby, Kansas, will always be with me. The Apostle Paul must have been a great, great leader of the church. He obviously was a servant who dedicated his life and his ministry to proclaiming the good news of the gospel. Warfare was threatened, he went right on. If his spiritual life was challenged, he went right on. If it cost him his friends because of the gospel of Jesus Christ, he went right on. Imprisonment, that made no difference to Paul. God's call upon his life was singular. Proclaim the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ as far as I can travel. And he did that. Establishing the church in ancient cities, major cities of that time and in that part of the world. Corinth, Galatia, Ephesus, Rome, and other places. But as those churches were established and as they began to live together, and as the early church came upon the realization that the world was not coming to an end and the second coming was not going to happen in their lifetime, they began to settle down for the long haul and began to establish the church and how we continue this ministry. And that's when some problems began to arise in the life of the church. There were issues that they had to make decisions about. There were personalities that were challenging that they had to deal with. Some of those issues involved Paul because he established the church, and some people wanted to always go to him when there was a problem, even though he may have been miles in another country away. Others wanted to claim that their baptism was better because Paul had baptized them rather than someone else baptizing them. And so there were all these issues, some that seemed to us maybe petty, others that were substantial and continue to shape our life as church today. But all that is to say is that church has always been a community of people. And from the day of Pentecost forward, church has always been a community of people that didn't see eye to eye, because on Pentecost, God said everyone is a part of the church. Not just you Jews who have been my called people from ancient times, but also Gentiles that you have despised. Jew and Gentile are a part of the church from this day forward. And so there were conflicts and problems and discussions and arguments. Some said their position in the life of the church was more important than others. Some said their gifts of ministry were more important than others. Some said that laity were more important than clergy, and some said clergy were more important than laity. Some said, as I mentioned a moment ago, that their baptism was better than another person's baptism. Not because they were immersed as opposed to sprinkling or pouring, but because of who administered the baptism. So there were all these issues. And Paul enters the picture in Ephesus through a letter that we call the book or the epistle of Ephesians. And he reminds them that above all else, there is one body and there is one Spirit. There is one God and there is one baptism. Not one form of baptism, but one baptism. We were all baptized into Christ. And we have all been called into the ministry of Jesus Christ, the ministry of the church. But we all have different gifts. Some can sing and play instruments. Some used to be able to work a sound system. I don't sing there anymore. And a camera. Others of you have gifts. Some are called to preach. Some are called to teach. Some are called to servant ministries of help.